Okay, thank you. And our next presenter. So Dr. Joanie King is another colleague of mine from the same department, Extension Plant Sciences at NMSU. She's the assistant professor and extension entomologist for NMSU for the Cooperative Extension Service statewide. She earned a PhD in entomology from Texas A&M University, a master's of science in entomology from the University of Georgia, and a bachelor of science in biology from the University of Central Florida. Alongside her extension and outreach focus, Dr. King's lab focuses on host-parasite interactions, community ecology, and integrated pest management. In addition to serving the NMSU community through extension and research, she's active in the Entomological Society of America, sharing bug science is cool. Thanks so much. Yeah.
No. Advance? Oh, how do I go back? Oh, the right button. Okay. Well, howdy, everybody. Can you hear me all right? Barely? Okay. So. Is that better? Can y'all hear me? All right. Awesome. Cool. Well, howdy, everybody. Yeah, my name's Joanie. I've been at NMSU for almost a year and a half now. The first year has been like drinking from the fire hose, but I will say it's been very exciting because I've got to meet a whole bunch of folks and bugs. So it's been super fun. So today I'm going to talk about some of the bugs that I've had people send into the plant diagnostics clinic and ask questions about, but also talk about some of those beneficials that can help us out. So just an overview for my talk, I'm going to go over some IPM basics. It'll be a review from yesterday, like Dr. Beck and Dr. Lujan. So IPM is really an important part when we're dealing with managing pests, whether that's diseases, weeds, or insects or other arthropods. And then I'll go into beneficials and pests of certain types of trees. So your, pinions and then fruit trees, things like that. And then I'll go into some tips for attracting these beneficial insects. So what is IPM? This is a review from yesterday. Basically, IPM is this approach that we use to manage pests that utilizes cultural, mechanical, physical, biological, and chemical methods to suppress pests. So chemicals, yes, insecticides, pesticides are a part of IPM. It's not something that we do that doesn't include chemicals because that is a part of it. And basically, the idea is that we're utilizing IPM to help minimize risks to the environment. And this can be economic or environmental health too. So that's what IPM is for. So as an example that I like to use, let's say you have some aphids, you introduce a parasitoid wasp. That's a form of biological control to help minimize that pest pressure, those aphids. So IPM really, the core of it is prevention. So we can't stress this enough, keeping things healthy really is the way to go. So for the case of us with trees, when we're thinking about prevention, we want proper tree selection and planting, making sure you plant them in a good place to begin with, right? And then this idea of, identification is super important. And I know Dr. Beck talked about that, and so did Dr. Lujan. So identification is super key, whether that's knowing if you're dealing with a pest or if you actually have a good bug and what insecticides to select, because that's super important, especially with things like insecticide resistance these days, which is like a super real thing. And then, assessing damage, and then, you want to monitor, and then there's these thresholds you can use depending on your system, like what are your action and aesthetic thresholds. And then finally, we get into this appropriate management. So that's your cultural, mechanical, chemicals, so on and so forth. And this varies for each system, for each pest. So, in a way, like I like to say to people, you get to be an ecologist yourself, because there's a lot of elements that go into this pest management. So the way that I like to look at IPM is this good old IPM pyramid. It helps me visualize it. So basically, you're starting at the bottom here. So this is that prevention, right? We want to be preventative, prevent the pest from coming in the first place. So this is where we really utilize these cultural methods. So things like sanitation, tree maintenance, irrigation, fertilization, those types of things, keeping them healthy, keeping them happy. And then we This is a little confusing here. We move up in the pyramid. So this is mechanically, physically keeping things out or removing them physically. Biological, so your parasitoids and your predators that feed on those pests. And then finally, we get up into your intervention here and chemicals, right? So organics are considered chemical. So, they are part of this chemical top of the pyramid, but really, you're working up in this intervention and toxicity, to your environment. So really, like, I stress this part, but these are a part of IPM for sure. So when we're using chemicals, they are important, and we they are a part of this IPM thing, but we really need to use them responsibly. And it's not just because of insecticide resistance, but because of pollinators as well. So there's tips for using those, like not spraying when flowering plants and pollinators are active. So when they're actually out there flying, your bees and your butterflies, other insects that pollinate. And there are these pollinator protection strategies that are used at local, state, and nationwide level to help protect pollinators and their habitats. So if you want to know more about that, there is this website. If you just Google, tools and strategies of pollinator protection, this pops up right here. But here's that link. But if you want to know more about that for each area and plants and things like that, you can find it on there. So yeah, chemicals really are a part of IPM, but we want to use these practices that help reduce exposure to beneficial insects and to other animals in the environment. So these are very common things, like avoid spraying when it's windy, following those labels, avoid spraying when flowers are in bloom. And then again, reading the label. The label is law. I will mention that again. It's super important. And sometimes those update. So I might tell you something, but it might have changed like the week before. So always read that label. That is the contract between you and the company. It's the law, period. So yeah, read those labels. And then as far as the pollinator stuff goes, do your homework ahead of time, like check to see when these pollinators are active, and do it before you schedule an appointment. It's really frustrating when you're about to do it, you look it up, you're like, oh shoot, I can't do it today, or it's not the right conditions. So just, do it ahead of time. So trees are super important, and we know that, like, they provide a lot of really benefits to us as humans and to animals and other wildlife as well. And trees are super important for pollinators. So trees in New Mexico that attract insect pollinators. There's this awesome list of trees in this website down here, but here are just some examples. But basically any fruit tree, pollinators love that, like bees, not just Apis mellifera, the European honeybee, but things like our native bees and other pollinating insects. They love the nectar from fruit trees. So you can't go wrong with that. So now I'm going to get into all these different insects, these different pests and these beneficials. But the way that I'll present it is that it's kind of together, because some insects like to eat other insects more than others. So when I talk about the pests, I'll talk about the beneficials that prey upon them as well. So first, I'm going to talk about these coniferous trees. So again, the bugs that I'm presenting today are all insects and arthropods that have been sent to the plant diagnostics clinic. These are all things that people have wanted identifications for, or they wanted to know how to manage it, or they physically sent in a sample, or they emailed me. So a combination of all those. So, and I have some pictures as well. So. The first one, aphids. So I've had a variety of different species of aphids, and I'll talk a little bit about those throughout this presentation. So one that's been sent in is this giant conifer aphid, also called white pine aphids or pine aphids. So a variety of species in this genera, Serenia. So these bugs, they're pretty large for aphids. They are up to about 1/4 inch in length. So that's pretty sizable for an aphid. They're dark in their coloration, and then they have like these really long legs. They look pretty leggy, almost like a spider. The adults may be winged or wingless, and that's pretty standard for aphids in general. So usually with insects, immatures don't, the immatures don't have wings and adults have wings, but in aphids, the immatures are sometimes wingless. And that's because aphids have these migration dispersing stages where they do have wings. So sometimes the adults in these will have wings or not. And for these aphids, there's a specific species for each tree genus. So in this genus of these aphids, you might have ones on different coniferous trees, but they all are in the same genus and their management is pretty similar. So as far as monitoring and management goes for these pine aphids, you want to regularly check your trees for them. Populations become highest in the late spring. So, kind of check in around that time, making sure that their numbers don't get too high. And the thing with these is they have several generations per year. So really monitoring is important for these aphids. Another common sign of them is this honeydew. And this is pretty standard for a lot of aphids. The way that aphids feed is that they have these piercing sucking mouthparts. So they're sucking up that plant. They're sucking up those juices and they have to excrete this honeydew because they're constantly like having to regulate their body. So think of it like if you were to attach your mouth to like a fire hydrant and you're drinking from that, that's basically what aphids do. So they're constantly having to expel this sugar water, and ants love the stuff. So sometimes ants are a symptom of those aphids because they love drinking that honeydew from the aphids, but they can be quite damaging. The aphids, they will cause mold to grow on trees because of the honeydew. They can vector diseases, those types of things. But the good news is that a lot of things love to feed on aphids, and management for them, as long as you catch them, is, there's a lot of strategies for this. So the first thing that you can do with managing your trees, making sure they don't have aphids, is keeping them healthy. Research has shown that aphids target stressed trees. They can cue in on that. They love it. They will happily go to a stressed tree to go and feed. So keeping those trees healthy, happy, well-watered, fertilized is the first step. But then if, because life gets busy, things get chaotic, there are other management strategies for aphids. So biological control, the good news is a lot of things love to eat aphids. They're tasty little packets of deliciousness for a lot of variety of bugs. We have things like lady beetles and other ladybird beetles that like to feed on them. Both the adults and the larvae feed on aphids. We have things like hoverflies, so these syrphids, and they can eat hundreds of aphids in a day, like the larvae of these hoverflies. And another good thing about these hoverflies is that they are pollinators as well, like generalist pollinators, very beneficial. We have things like lacewing larvae, parasitoid wasps, big-eyed bugs, minute pirate bugs, and these are all feeding on different stages of aphids and other soft-bodied insects as well. And some of these you can encourage in your landscapes, and some of them you can actually purchase as well. It depends on what pest you're dealing with, but I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end on how to attract some of these beneficials. The next one that I've gotten sent in is this juniper twig pruner. So this is a longhorn beetle. These beetles are pretty small. They got this reddish head. This is yeah, got it. Red head, darkish body. It can be brown or black. They have these very long antennae, as cerambicids do, and the larvae are very small and white or creamy white in color. But you don't see them because they're inside the plant, right? But you do see some, signs of their damage here. So like here's some damaged junipers and then exit holes like borers do. The good news about this particular pest is that, it tends to be cosmetic and temporary. So it seems very startling at first when you see the damage, but they're not going to kill your junipers. But basically, and you're going to hear this a lot, keep your trees and your shrubs happy, properly space your junipers in urban settings. That's an IPM tip for these guys for avoiding them. Watering appropriately, not too much, not too little. And if there is an infestation, you can prune dead or infested branches and make sure to discard them. Don't compost them or leave them out, because guess what's inside of those things that you cut? Yes, the larvae, they're in there. So you don't want them emerging and then reinfesting, right? So there are no registered insecticides for these. So really it's that cultural and mechanical type approach. Next one, I don't know what's happened with that slide, but next thing, I have here are these juniper minute cypress scales. So I get a lot of questions about scales, and I'll go over a few of them. Scales are super strange insects. They are related to aphids. They're piercing, sucking, mouth party insects that feed on, a plant similarly to like the aphids do. But scales are very strange. There's a variety of species of them. They have these coverings, these waxy coverings. The females don't move. They're sessile. They stay in one place. And then the males are winged and they mate. They disperse occasionally. And it's really different for each species. But anyway, these I've had sent in. And the adult females of these cypress scales, they look kind of like eggs to me in a way. They have this covering that they have, this waxy covering. It's white. Creamy with like this yellowish, darker center on top. They're about 1.5 millimeters in diameter. And then they do have nymphs, which I'll show you in a second. And that's going to be very key for managing scales. But right here, if we look, you can see some of this damage from them. And then if you look closer, you can see these, and that's, you got that scale. So monitoring and managing scales, for a lot of scales, it tends to be late May and late June. Some are in the fall as well. But for these particular ones, you want to just look for them. But you can also use double-sided tape and wrap them around the twigs. Cultural things, again, keep your trees healthy, your trees and shrubs healthy, happy. Stressed trees have a difficult time with scale infestations, and they also, the scales target that. There are biological methods. There are many natural enemies of these scales, these cypress scales. So there are predatory mites. There are parasitoid wasps. There are ladybird beetles that like to eat them. And one cool thing is some scales, birds like to eat them as well. So if you have a bird bath, that encourages birds to come, and that's another form of biological control. There are insecticides available for scales, but it's really, really important to read those labels on those, and all of them, every single chemical insecticide available for scales targets the crawlers, these guys. Okay, so those this is a picture I took under a microscope. They're very tiny, but these very tiny bugs. If you look at your plants, you see these tiny little specks of yellow kind of crawling around. Sometimes they seem like they're mites, but if you have scales present, then you know that you probably have these crawlers. So all of the insecticides available requires you to target those. Okay, the adults are protected. It's not going to, it's not going to kill the adults. It's going after those crawlers. Next, pinion needle scale. I've also, as I mentioned, I have some scales in here. So they're also small, but they look a little bit different. The adults, they look kind of like these blackish little bumps, like these little beans on the plants. And the females will come out from their coverings to move. And then the males, as I mentioned, in scales, are like these winged insects that are very temporary and seasonal, but they will mate with the females. So that's what they look like. And the damage for them on pinion that you can see here, you get some discoloration, dying back leaves and things like that from the action of their feeding. But they also have this another sign of this nasty looking white gooby stuff. This is webbing an egg, so they cover their eggs in that. So that's a symptom of that. So how do you manage them? Keeping the trees and healthy and happy, that's step number one. But what can you do? There are some mechanical things that you can do. You can physically remove them with a strong stream of water to dislodge those egg masses. So here you can actually dislodge these. And there are labeled insecticides available for these needle scales. But again, timing is extremely important. You're going to want to target those crawlers when they're present. And the labels will have those information. And we also do on NMSU have guides for when these are active and when you should be thinking about it. Next, spider mites. I've had so many different types of spider mites sent into the diagnostics clinic. So these spruce and pine spider mites, there's pretty much spider mites for pretty much every plant, I think. I've dealt with a lot of spider mites, and we get a lot in New Mexico because they like dusty areas. So that, you know, there you go. But the mites, what do they look like? They're very tiny. You know, when you're looking at them, they look like the size of a period. Some of them are a little bigger. Some of them are a little smaller even. Mites are crazy. But these guys, they vary in color, but they have like this oval kind of body. Mites, depending on your species, you get round or oval or rice shaped. These vary, yeah, I mentioned they vary in color, brown, green, pink, gray. Depending on the species, populations can be abundant anytime in the year, spring to fall. I usually don't deal too much with them in winter, except for people that have certain like urban issues like mites in their house, but that's not related to these particular ones that go after your pines. So when populations are dense, you can also sometimes see this webbing and eggs found all over the plant. It almost looks like a spider web on your plant. So that can be indicative of them, but you also can see this feeding damage here. You know, you get discoloration and dieback from their feeding. So what can you do? What's the first step? You can wash them off. No, keeping your plants healthy and happy. It's okay, but you can wash them off sometimes. It's true. So there are biological control methods for these. There are predaceous mites available for a lot of species of these parasitic or, you know, phytophagous mites. There are chemicals available, but you really need to be careful with these, especially with mites, because if they are absolutely necessary, you want to use selective miticides because or horticulture oils, because secondary outbreaks of these they can be very problematic. So you really want to make sure that, you know, you're not making your problem worse in the future. So it can be tricky, but there are some other tips for mites that I'll talk about later. Maybe I'll just mention it now, but you can for pines and junipers, you can rinse your foliage. Yeah. All right, another one that I've had sent in quite a few times is this pitch mast borer or the pitch moth. So these they are pretty gnarly bugs. These are moths, pyralids. The adult moths, you rarely observe them, but it's hard to tell because they look like any other drab moth that you might get in your house. Like, do y'all remember when we had the mass moth, the Miller moths? Does anyone remember that? Yeah, so they look kind of like that. They're just like a drab looking moth. I'll show you a picture in a second, but the larvae are the real damaging stage, and they are these white, creamy white, gray. Sometimes they can even be pinkish or like a greenish color, but they're the damaging stage, and they cause this large oozing soft pitch masses in your trees, in your pinions. So what can you do about them? So again, keeping your trees healthy, happy, but also for these particular ones, pruning can be a little bit, you know, managing that. So you want to avoid pruning during the summer months. And that's because these moths target that injury. They cue in on that. They're looking for places to lay their eggs, and they're like, sweet, you made my life easier, you know? So managing when you do your pruning for when they're active is important. You want to manically, you can remove the larva with a knife. Be careful. Don't say I made you get cut, please, but you can do this, you know, within reason. You can't physically remove them. And unfortunately for these, insecticides are not found to be effective. So really just keeping an eye on it, removing those masses, and keeping your trees healthy and happy. So then we also have the pinion tip moth. This is a different family of moth, Tortricidae. And the adults for these moths, they're kind of colorful, like orangey. They got these like white scales with, they're white and orange, and they hold their wings like a tent over their body. The larvae are about half an inch to 3/4 an inch in length, and they're dark brown to orangey red in color, and they got like this dark head. They're pretty distinctive looking, these larvae for this moth, and their damage is pretty characteristic. They have on the tips here, right? So that's why they're called pinion tip moth. You get like a little bit of oozing here and then die back. That's pretty standard for that. So what can you do? How do you manage these? How do you monitor for them? Thankfully, these have 1 generation per year. Not too bad. Emergence activity begins in early spring. And it's keeping your trees healthy. They target stressed trees. And there are chemicals available for managing the pinion tip moth. And this is to prevent, if you know that they're present, you can do it. It's a preventative type insecticide. So, you know, from getting them to come to your trees if you know that they're present. And again, follow that label. Next one, I get a lot of questions about the Ips beetles, and they can be quite damaging, quite tragic. And unfortunately, I don't have really good news for you because a lot of the strategies for dealing with wood-borne insects, especially with these beetles, is preventative, preventing them from getting into the trees in the first place. So these beetles attack all species of pines, these Ips beetles. The adult beetles are pretty small, about 3 to 5 millimeters in length. They're long, cylindrical. Their color varies, but they're kind of dark. They could be like darkish red, brown, black. And the larvae are C-shaped. But really, like, their damage is pretty characteristic when you're like seeing your trees. So they get this top kill, like down, you know, method. And you also see the boring dust from Ips attacks in your trees. So a lot of that, like, you know, dust coming out from the larva's feeding activity and, you know, then coming out. So monitoring and managing these, again, these target stressed trees, keeping your trees healthy as possible, watering, avoiding injury. Also avoid creating lodging slash from December to June. That's been known to help with dealing with these because they create breeding grounds and material for these beetles. So keeping, you know, a thought on that is important when we're dealing with these. And the chemicals, the insecticides are available for Ips. They're all preventative. Unfortunately, once they get in the tree, they're not going to be effective. These you apply to newly transplanted trees or stressed trees. So there are labeled insecticides available for your Ips. And there's a variety of them. But again, none of them are going to save the tree. And I get a lot of questions about, okay, what do I do? And they already have so many beetles in their tree. I mean, sometimes trees surprise us. And if you have like a small infestation, they can, you know, sometimes recover, but a lot of times once they have these beetles, it is pretty bad. And I know that trees can be very sentimental and important, especially if your grandfather planted it, but maybe consider, you know, planting a tree with your, like a new tree with your family, or maybe using the wood for something like that. Can be some ways that you can deal with that. But unfortunately, there's no miracles when you get those beetles in your trees. No, they're just stressed trees. Sometimes more old trees are more susceptible because, you know, they're more stressed. Not like me. They're like, oh, yeah, like the older you get, the more stressed you get, right? So, yeah, sometimes, not always. Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, he was asking about, does the diameter of the tree matter for these beetles to attack? And not necessarily. It just depends on how stressed your trees are. Usually older trees are more susceptible, right? The old trees tend to be more stressed, but you know, it varies. All right, so now moving along to our fruit trees. One that I get a lot of questions about is the codling moth. These are pests of a variety of fruits like apples and pears. So the codling moth, these adults, they're pretty drab looking, a drab looking moth. They're about a half an inch. They have these molted wings. They hold their wings like a tent over their body. The larvae are about half an inch long. They're beige to tan with a darkish head. And their damage is, this is usually the thing that people send photos about or ask about. It's like these dimples on the fruits, you know, from their feeding, they push out this frass. It's like, that's, oops. So frass is the word for insect poop, but yeah, so they've like push out like their frasses through their feeding. So these guys, they emerge in the spring and near bloom time. They lay their eggs on fruits and on leaves. Once the eggs hatch, they'll look for, the larva will look for a fruit to burrow into. full-grown larva will tunnel out of the fruit and then pupate beneath debris or under, like by the trees here. So that's where they're going to pupate and then emerge as adults and repeat the cycle. So what can you do? There's a lot of monitoring strategies for these available. We have guides on our NMSU site as well. So for coddling moths, they have these pheromone traps so you can see if they're present. So that's pretty key with managing them. And what can you actually do? Remove and destroy any fallen or infested fruit immediately. You can thin fruits to prevent them from touching each other. That's a common entry point for larvae. They prefer those fruits that are touching. Bagging fruits when they're smaller. This is, if you have like a couple of trees in your yard, this is practical, right? But not if you have like a whole orchard of a lot of them. But that is one mechanical strategy that you can use. Banding trees with sticky traps. Some of these, they say, put cardboard with the, sorry. with like the sticky glue that you put on the cardboard, but you discard it later. It's on the tree, not in the soil. And there are predators that like to feed on these guys. So minute pirate bugs, green lacewing larvae, spiders, parasitoid wasps. So thankfully there are a lot of things that like to eat them. And there are insecticides available, but again, like you want, like with any insect with trees, you've got to get them before they get inside that fruit or that tree, right? So the insecticides are only preventative before the larvae get inside the fruit. So follow those labels. Next one, the apple maggot, or also called railroad worm. These are pests of apples, pears, crabapple, hawthorn. They are kind of small-ish, they don't ever get bigger than a quarter of an inch long. They have these spotted wings or striped, they have these striped wings, these clear wings with these black markings on them. And then they have these 3 to 4 white stripes on their abdomen. The larvae, you don't see them because they're inside the fruit, but they're tiny, they're cream colored, they're legless. But you're gonna, the thing that you'll notice is the stings or dimples on the fruit. So the larvae are the damaging stage. They're the ones that are causing the fruit to be deformed looking and if you have a lot of infestations of them, you get a lot of misshapen fruit and distorted fruit on your trees. So these guys, they emerge in the summer. They lay their eggs under the skin fruit by late summer, and the maggots will feed for 3 to 4 weeks and then emerge from the fruit by the late fall. And then they'll pupate underground in the soil near the infested trees. And this can be a year to 2. So yeah. But what can you do? How do you monitor them? How do you manage them? So there are traps and pheromone traps available. So sticky yellow card traps. There's also these apple traps. People ask me like, oh, which works better? Some research says that the apple, it looks like the apple, so they like them better, but they'll be attracted to both. They're very, they cue in on these pheromones, so either is fine. And then you'll want to be checking these traps during your growing season. So cultural methods, sanitation is extremely important for the apple maggot. Harvesting fruits promptly, not leaving any fruit on the ground, removing fallen, overripened fruit is very important. And then also removing abandoned fruit trees. So fruit trees you aren't using, because those could be sites for them to infest. Mechanical methods. There are a variety of things you can do to discourage their egg laying. So you can apply like this clay to this fruit, but it's kind of messy to reapply it. But that is one strategy people use. Chemicals are available, insecticides are available, but you should use them in conjunction with traps, those pheromone traps, to assess if you need to apply. And there are labeled insecticides for apple maggots available. Unfortunately for these, the natural enemies or beneficials aren't as effective. So you're going to really want to use that monitoring in conjunction with your insecticide applications. And then again, sanitation. Next one I've had questions about, the fruit tree beetle, the green fruit beetle, or the fig eater is what they're called. So these are scarabs, and they'll eat a variety of fruits, especially soft-bodied fruits. They love it. like I do. So these guys, the larvae are quite large. They can be up to 2 inches long. Sometimes people see them in their compost. They're cream colored. They curl into a C shape when they're disturbed. The adults are pretty little things. They're like these shiny green beetles, very, very large, they can be over 1 inch long. And their damage, they go after ripening fruit. So they're just going after fruit when fruit's present. Thankfully, it's very easy to deal with them because you can manually just like crush them and destroy the beetles if you find them. For cultural methods, managing grubs by removing leaf litter and decaying organic materials near your fruit trees because they cue in on that. And traps aren't recommended, insecticides aren't recommended because they're going after ripe fruit. So you can just hand remove them. That's it. Okay, peach tree borer. This is a problematic insect. So they go after not only peaches, but apricots, nectarines, plums. The adult moths, again, another drab looking moth, grayish, molted kind of in color, pointed head. The larvae, so these guys, when they're early instars, they're light brown with rings in their body with the black head. And then the later instars get darker and darker and darker. So you can see here, they're pretty distinctive looking. Their damage, their early generations bore into new shoots and they kill them and causes the leaves to wilt. Early generations, they create these exit holes too. So they can lead to stunt growth in your trees and because of this terminal branch death. So they're, attacking those terminal growth sites. So they mature as overwintering larvae and they pupate in protected areas under protective, they protect them in the crotches of like the branches, the trees there. The larvae, they emerge during bloom and initially feed on young leaves and buds, but then they bore into the shoot, causing it to wilt. Then the later generations will bore into the fruit. So these are going after your buds and your fruit. So they're eating different parts of the plant. And then the moths will emerge in the spring when it's bloom time, and you can get 3 generations of these per year. So monitoring is very important. You want to examine those shoots in the spring, look for wilted shoots, cultural pruning and destroying infested shoots. So you can actually remove where they're present and discard those. There are biological agents for these peach twig borers. So we do have parasitoid wasps and a certain genus of ants, Formica, will like to feed on them. And there are insecticides available, but you're going to want to apply them when the larvae are first active and once their damage has been observed before they enter the plant. And there are pheromone traps available for monitoring these, and they should be placed in your orchards in May. And this helps with the timing of those insecticides. Next, the Western cherry fruit fly. I only had 1 sample of this sent in, or maybe it was a picture. I can't remember. It all bleeds together. But these guys, they look similar to the apple maggots, but they're a little bit larger. And these are specifically pests on cherries. So these guys, they got those clear wings with the black stripes on them. They are quite large for a fly, about 1/5 an inch long. The wings have these bands, as I mentioned. The larvae are white inside. They're not going to see them though. They're inside the fruit. Their damage, when there's high populations, it can ruin almost all the fruit on the trees. It can be quite nasty. So you really want to monitor for these and determine, before they get out of hand. So it's difficult to determine whether fruit is infested until the larvae emerge from the cherry. So that's why monitoring is really important. And there are some flies that look superficially similar, but these guys, they have very distinctive wing venation, wing markings. So here this is kind of like what they look like here. They have this like white, like this, it's a little different from this, but that can help with identification. So the pupae overwinter in the soil. The adults emerge in the late spring or early summer. The females puncture the skin of the developing cherry and lay their eggs inside of those, and the larvae will feed inside of the fruit. So for these, their life cycle, monitoring them is important because you don't want reinfestation. So sticky traps are available for these as well, and you'll want to check them regularly. Also removing fallen fruit. It's pretty standard, a lot of like the management for these fruit tree pests with these flies. So what we can do mechanically, ground barriers such as mulch can reduce its ability to pupate, but make sure you check it for other pests. But they, that's where they like to go. Chemical should target the adult stage. Chemicals should target the adult stage, and the timing of the first spray is based on the interval between emergence of the females when they first lay eggs. So that's why these pheromone traps are very important. Next one, the brown apricot scale. I've had quite a few of these sent in. So these, like any other scale, they have these waxy coverings. So the adult females, they are shiny-ish brownish color, and they have this covering that looks kind of like a turtle shell almost, but they have like these ridged backs, and they are small, and they have those crawlers as well. Their damage is pretty, standard for any scale that from the way that they feed, right? And these guys can also lead to honeydew and ants attracted to them, and mold and that sort of thing. So high populations of them can also cause twig dieback once they get too out of hand. And here's some of that damage there. So the nymphs overwinter on twigs and small branches, and the females, they lay eggs on the underside of their covering so that they're protected. The crawlers, again, that's what you're going to want to target. But thankfully for these, they just have one generation per year. And yeah, just like keeping those trees healthy and happy. They do have natural enemies, those lacewings, those lady beetles. A lot of things like to eat them. And there are chemicals, as I mentioned, but again, they target the crawlers, read the label. Peach tree borer, another serious pest that I get questions about. These are pests of peach, plums, apricots, cherries. They're pretty, pretty distinctive looking, the adults. So this is the female, this is the male. They almost look like wasps, but it's just mimicry. They can't actually sting you or anything like that. The larvae are creamy in color, and the damaging stages, the larvae feed on bark, which causes damages to the trunk and the limbs and the roots, which may result in tree death. It's a very serious pest, so you want to catch them soon. And they also, sometimes you see this ganosis, these balls of saps found at the trunk, at the base of the tree where they're active. So that's pretty indicative of them. And then sometimes you can see the pupal cases as well at the root, at the base of the tree. So you can physically remove those if you see them. So the moths emerge during the summer, and they immediately lay eggs in the lower trunk bark or within soil cracks. And then the larvae will bore into those cracks or through wound openings, and they feed on sapwood until cold weather arrives. And then the larvae will overwinter underground, and they begin feeding as soon as it warms up. And then they pupate near the base of the tree. So if you see those pupa like this, definitely remove them. So what can you do? There are pheromone traps available for them, and they are placed in the spring to monitor for those adults, okay? And they're left throughout the growing season to help reduce population. So thankfully these ones, like it's the monitoring and a little bit of mechanical. Again, keeping your trees healthy and happy. They go after stress trees. Avoid mulching too much up at the base of the tree. And there are biological control agents that like to feed on these guys. So we have a variety of predators and parasitoids. And there are insecticides available, but they are only preventative for these guys. Bagworms, I've had a lot of bagworms sent from a variety of different trees this year. So these can be pests. Sometimes, they don't cause too much damage, but sometimes they really can. So these are lepidopterans. They are moths. They are pests of a variety of trees and shrubs. And what they look like, they're kind of weird for a moth. So the females never become weaned adults. They always stay in this bag, but there is a mating, dispersing phase here. We have the males, they're weaned, and they'll mate with the bag. And then the female, when she's mature, she'll become like an egg case full of eggs here. So the damage is through the females and the larval feedings. They will feed on tips of trees, and then they'll feed on the whole tree, and it can lead to defoliation and even death if there's too much of an infestation. So what can you do? Well, their life cycle, jumping ahead of myself, sorry. Bagworms hatch in the mid-spring to late spring up to early June. And after hatching, they emerge and they spin, like they make this bag around this protective covering, and like this, like so. And then the larva will feed up until about late August. And then they, as I mentioned, the female will become an egg case essentially. So what can you do? Mechanically removing them is a method. So actually handpicking them, putting them in a bucket of soapy water, destroying them. You don't want to leave those bags on the ground because they could just be egg cases to reinfest your tree. Thankfully, there's lots of biological control agents of these, lots of natural enemies of bagworms. There's over 10 species of parasitoid wasps in the family Echimonidae. Lots of things like to eat them in Hymenoptera. Nematodes as well. There are insecticides available, but you want to use one that targets those young larvae, okay, in the late spring. And again, read those labels. Aphids, I believe this is the last pest I'm talking about. I could be wrong, but I think it is the last that I will mention. So earlier on, I said I get lots of different species of aphids, and fruit trees are no exception. There are a lot of different species of aphids. Some of them are specific on a particular type of plant. Like in this case, we have green peach aphid, woolly apple aphid, black cherry aphid, rosy apple aphid, a variety of different aphid pests. And they all look similar in their body structure, but their color of their body will vary. It just depends on what species you're dealing with. So for example, the woolly apple aphid, they have these like waxy fuzzy coverings. The black cherry aphids dark in color. Rosy apple aphid is like kind of like this like purplish brown color, and then the green peach aphid's green, but they all have those piercing sucking mouth parts. They're all kind of leggy looking with the long antennae. And identification, so a lot of times, you're seeing some of the damage they do, like with the molds and the sticky honeydew and the ants that they attract. So a lot of them, they all kind of have a lot of the same types of symptoms with yellowing leaves, twig dieback, that sort of thing. But as I mentioned, thankfully, a lot of things like to eat aphids. They are easier to manage compared to some of your other pests because there's a lot of different strategies available. So monitoring for them, checking for them. You can remove them physically with streams of water. You can apply sticky traps to prevent ants from feeding and tending and protecting them. And this is key for biological control, because if there's ants protecting aphids, they're not going to be as effective, right? Those lacewings, those lady beetles. So making sure that, you keep the ants away from protecting them too. So chemical controls, there are available except for woolly apple aphid. There isn't insecticides recommended for those, but for the rest of them there are. But I would use these strategies before you get to that. So I said I would talk about these beneficial bugs and how you can attract them and how you can utilize them in your landscape. So like I said, you get to be an ecologist. There's different, there's so complex. There's different ways to go about any sort of system, but a lot of the overall pictures are pretty similar, okay? So with these beneficials, you want to attract them, make it desirable for them to want to come there in the first place. So use a variety of native plants to provide a variety of food sources, or things that are known to be beneficial insectary plants, and I'll talk about that in a second. Providing shelter, okay? So including the mixture of features, ground cover plants, dead leaves, some areas of bare soil, nesting sites. There's even things available for native bees, like little structures for them to come and make their nests. So you think about maybe doing that. Identifying the pests, it's super key. I didn't have time to go into every single bug today. Like we could be together for a whole semester talking about bugs and like what they do and who they are. But identification is super important so that you know that you're using your insecticides right, but also so you're not, destroying your beneficial bugs. Because believe it or not, like even in certain groups like stink bugs, there are beneficial stink bugs that are predatory that eat your pest stink bugs. So learning to, identify can be important, or to take it to your county agent or your specialist and asking for assistance with that. And then be patient. Sometimes it takes time figuring it out, or, sometimes if you're using biological control, it takes them time to get their numbers up. So just being patient, it can take days or weeks. And if you choose an insecticide, make sure you consider choosing a selective one, not a generalist one, because broad spectrum insecticides also harm your beneficials. And then at the end of the day, keeping your plants healthy and happy, that can help your whole ecosystem. So these insectary plants, we have a really good resource for a whole list of plants you can use in your landscape to attract and sustain your beneficial insects. So there's a lot of these flowering plants that they like to feed on or take shelter, and they will go to these, but they'll also go to your trees where your bad bugs are. So they'll, provide that service for you. So with that, thank you. Here's my contact information. If you ever have bug questions, feel free to bug me. I'm always excited to see a picture of a bug, so don't worry about that. And I promised I'd put this slide too, so there it is. And then maybe they want to go to lunch.
Yeah, it's time for lunch. How about you? Yes.
Oh, that's a really good question. So with the beneficial insects, do they go after the other beneficials? That really depends. So the wasps are highly specific. They are, they have very intricate relationships with their hosts. But there are generalist predators that will go after some of those good bugs as well, right? So it just really depends. There's a lot of these, there's been research shown that they'll go after more soft-bodied insects. So that's why things like green lacewings and minute pirate bugs and big-eyed bugs are preferred, because things like mantises and spiders and some other beneficials, they'll eat just about anything. So it really is, it can be complicated, but that's why parasitoids are often preferred, because they go after like that specific species.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
One
If
more.
you could ask independently, because we're going to go to lunch, but